discussing the murder of 20. Greetings, citizens. Hey, you beautiful, creepy human being, you, and welcome to today's true crime episode. I am so happy that you are here. I am so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the murder of 22-year-old Rachel Keeley. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. Now, before we get into the details of today's case, I first need to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that is Aura. Now, I want to start this off with a question for you, okay? And the question for you is this. Have you ever Googled your name or the name of somebody you loved and been surprised to see how much of yours or their personal information was available on one of those public listing sites? Because when I tell you, it is far more common than you may think for your personal and private information to get into the hands of people that you just don't want to have it. And that is because there are these things out there called data brokers who sell your information to things, yes, people like spammers and robocallers. You know, all those random text and phone calls you get from number that you just don't recognize and you're like, this kind of feels like a scam? I am not down with that sickness. I value my privacy and I value your privacy. And that's why I want to introduce you to Aura. Now, I've got some good news for you and some bad news for you. The good news, data brokers are legally required to remove your information if you ask them to, which sounds great. Except the bad news is they make it super difficult for you to figure out which of the data brokers have your information. And that's one of the ways in which Aura comes in. They identify which of the pesky brokers have your information and they submit the opt-out request on your behalf. They do the work so that you do not have to. Now, when I first signed up for Aura, the very first thing I did is I went to the data broker opt-out section on their website because I was curious as to how many really had my information. And it turns out 30. Like 30, and Aura had already submitted opt-out requests on my behalf, and they do that for the lifetime of your membership with them. Thank you, Aura. They also see if your information has been leaked on the dark web, and if you know, you know. No one wants their information leaked on the dark web, and they check to see if the passwords you use on important websites like, I don't know, your banking, for example, are secure. And those are just a couple of ways that Aura helps protect you and yours, keeps you and yours safe online from threats that you just simply cannot see. Through just the Aura app, which is super easy to set up, you can get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. And you get it all in one place. There's no need for several different apps, and you get it all at one very affordable price. It sounds like a great deal to me. Now, listen, I'm not your mom. I can't tell you what to do, but what I can tell you is that I'm not going to leave myself and my family vulnerable to breaches and brokers. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/Bratterstein to get 2 weeks for free. And that is enough time for Aura to see if your personal data has been leaked online. So if all of that sounds as good to you as it does to me, make sure to use the link in my description box. It's aura.com/Bratterstein to let them know I'm the one that sent you. That does help out my channel. And get a 14-day free trial and see if your personal and private information has been leaked online. And if it has, let Aura help you put a stop to it today. Now, I just want to say a big thank you to Aura for partnering with me on today's video. It's partners like Aura that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock, don't ever change. Now, with all of that said, let's go ahead and get into this video. This video is on a case that is incredibly tragic. It's the story of a seemingly random murder of a beautiful girl who was just out walking her dogs in an area that should have been safe when she had a chance encounter with someone that she shouldn't have seen as a threat, her own 16-year-old neighbor. This was a kid who seemingly had a really good start at life, but somewhere down the line took a wrong turn and went down a dark path that led him to committing this horrific crime. And then from there, due to the lenient sentencing that he was given for this murder, he went on to commit multiple more crimes and victimize more people. With that said, today I'm going to tell you the entire story. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain as we go through the details of this case. But of course, I want you to answer once you have something to go on. But the question of the day is this. Do you believe that they had enough evidence to convict Rachel's killer? Once we get to the end of this video, I think you will be certain that he did it. But at the time that the trial took place, do you think they had enough to convict him? And do you think he was given enough time? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of 22-year-old Rachel Keeley. So our case today is going to take place in a place called Ballincollig, and this is a suburban town in Cork City in Ireland, the largest town in Cork County, and it is located on the western side of Cork City besides the River Lee. Hashtag geography. But anyways, that is where we are in Ireland or on Ireland, as it is an island. And we are specifically in Regional Park. And Regional Park is a park, obviously, that was developed on the site of the gunpowder mills at the old British Army barracks, but was now a popular spot for the locals to spend time. Okay, it was like a really beautiful, really large public park with several, quote, playing pitches, a skate park, river walks, numerous picnic areas, woodland trails, and paved walkways. So, a park. On Thursday, October 26th of the year 2000 at about 8 p.m., there were several people walking around this park. And of the group of people that were there were two people who had branched off and were walking together by the banks of the River Lee. And they're walking for a while and they get pretty deep into the woods. They're near the ruins of an old house when all of a sudden they see a hat on the ground. And right away, Rosalind, one of the people who was there, her name was Rosalind, and she was walking with somebody named Javin or Javin, Javin. So Rosalind and Javin, question mark, are walking along when they see a hat on the ground. And Rosalind recognizes this hat as belonging to her sister. So in seeing this hat, they start to approach it. And as they do, Javin hits his foot against something that is under the growth. There's like a lot of plants right there in a park. They're in like a wooded area, right? So he's walking and his foot hits something that feels unnatural. At that moment, he bent down and he started to move these ferns because they were, again, in the overgrowth. He starts to move these ferns that appeared to be like bent over each other and crossed in a way that wouldn't have happened in nature. So something that a person had done. And as he opens up these ferns, he sees what appears to be the small portion of a woman's back. And as soon as he does, he realizes what his foot hit when he was walking along with Rosalind. And this was a body. So with that, he reaches down and he touches the woman's back and he realizes that she's not breathing, but she is still warm. And in that moment, his friend that was with him, Rosalind, realizes what he has found and she starts to scream because she realizes that they just found the body of her missing sister, Rachel. Rachel Keeley was born to parents John and Rose, and she was one of 5 children with 3 sisters named Sarah, Rosalind, and Elizabeth, and one brother named Jason. Rachel, from the time she was little, was known as being just a beautiful girl inside and out. She was described as lovely and bright and was said to have been loved by every single person who knew her. Rachel graduated from high school and did some college before eventually transitioning to going to beauty school. She was training to be a beautician because she knew that, one, this job was something she could really enjoy doing. She had had other jobs before this, even working for a short time as an au pair in Italy. But going to beauty school felt more in line with her goals. And on top of that, it would leave her free to have time to explore her real passion, which was working with her church doing missionary work. Rachel was born into a religious household. Her whole family were Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses. That's even how her mother and father met. They met through the church. And Rachel herself had gone on to find love in the church as well. She had a boyfriend at the time she was killed, and he was part of her church as well. He was also a Jehovah's Witness. Rachel was not involved with her church by obligation, right? Like sometimes when kids grow up in a religious household, they feel obligated to participate in that religion, but that wasn't Rachel. She had a very strong faith and was an active member of her congregation, and it was something that she was very proud of, and it's something that her family was very proud of her for. They loved her and who she was, and they were devastated by her loss. Which, speaking of, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the last time that her family saw her, or more specifically, the last time her mother saw her. It was about 4:30 p.m. on October 26th, and this was in the year 2000, and Rachel was at her home in the Inishmore Square estate. She had been just at home studying her Bible. She was getting ready to actually go to Bible study in about an hour, and she decided that she was going to leash up her two dogs and take them for a walk in Regional Park. Her mother, Rose, was home preparing dinner, and on her way out, Rachel let her mom know that she would be back and she would be eating dinner with her family before leaving for Bible study. So clearly, she had plans, right? She was going to have dinner with her family. She was going to go to Bible study. So she obviously had the intent on returning home pretty quickly, but she didn't. About an hour after Rose watched her daughter leave with the dogs going through a gap in the fence heading to Regional Park, she heard the sounds of scratching at her door. And when she opened the door, she found that her two dogs had returned, but Rachel was nowhere to be found. So immediately, this put her in a bit of a panic mode. Rachel would never just let the dogs be up by themselves. Rachel was always the type of girl to bring the dogs back in. She'd specifically bring them in through the back entrance. So the fact that they were here and they were alone was something that was just completely unusual. Now, somehow, even though this was immediately strange to her mother, Rose didn't go into a full blown panic. She actually waited for her husband John to get home from work before going out to look for Rachel. But as soon as he got home, she decided she was going to go out, and she and Rachel's little sister, this was Rose's youngest daughter Elizabeth, went out and headed to Regional Park because they knew that that is where Rachel would typically take the dogs. And they even walked the path that Rachel would typically take, but there was no sign of her. Well, at the park, Rose and Elizabeth called out to Rachel over and over, but got no response. The only thing they actually heard while they were out in the park was the sound of either a scream or a cry. And Elizabeth remembers hearing this and at first thinking that it was coming from one of the nearby playing fields, but said that it sounded, quote, low to the ground, which was unusual. And Rose had also heard this scream or cry, but in the moment could not acknowledge that this may have been coming from her daughter. And on top of that, they had no idea where the sound of the scream was coming from, so there wasn't really anything they could do. From there, hours went by, and at about 7 p.m., they realized that like this was a problem. Rachel still wasn't back. So Rose and John made some phone calls. They gathered some friends together, and they decided that they were going to go out and have like a big search party look for her. They went and they bought some lighting so that they could, aid in their nighttime search. But within an hour at about 8 p.m., Rachel's body was found by that friend of the family, Jabin, who we mentioned in the beginning, and she was found face down by the ruins of this old house covered in foliage. Now, immediately 911 was called, or I don't know if it's 911 in Ireland. You'll have to let me know. Emergency services were called, but when they got there, they found that it was too late. Rachel was gone. She had been murdered, and her body was in sort of an unnatural position, like she had been drugged to where she was found. And she was like lying in the fetal position, and the ferns, the overgrowth was like intentionally put over her. They could tell by looking at it that the stalks of the plants, like the sticks of the plants, had been bent or broken intentionally to cover and hide her. Now, they were able to tell from the scene that Rachel had likely been the victim of a sexual assault. They weren't going to be able to tell it for certain. They would have to wait for her autopsy. But just in looking at her clothing, she was fully dressed, but her clothes looked to be tampered with, would be the best way I could describe it. And they couldn't tell for sure if her clothing was like that just from the activity of her murder or from a sexual assault, but they were going to operate under the assumption that it was a sexually motivated crime. And, once her autopsy was performed, they were able to get some more clarity around that. And it seemed that they were going down the right path because based on DNA evidence that was recovered from the scene and from her body, they were able to determine that, yes, there was a sexual element to this crime. So they took that, the evidence, the DNA evidence that was found on and around her, and they combined it with the fact that based on the scene, they were able to tell that Rachel had likely tried to flee her attacker after the the sexual activity took place. And in looking at that, they realized that she had run into an area of, quote, impenetrably dense vegetation and was overpowered. And since this was after whatever sexual activity had taken place, this would mean that there was no question of consent in any way, because somebody who consents to sexual activity isn't then going to like run away from you so that you won't kill them. But, anyways, back to the autopsy. They were able to tell that Rachel's cause of death was asphyxiation, and due to or based rather on the extreme trauma that she had to her neck, which they attributed to her being in a headlock, they were able to tell that one, she was strangled, not smothered, and two, whoever had done this had intended to kill her. It wasn't an accident. Now, people were shocked, as I'm sure you can imagine. Like, murders have become shockingly commonplace now, right? This was 25 years ago at this point, and we hear about murders every other day. But at that time, in that place, it wasn't common. And the idea of a teenage girl, or not teenage, she was 22, but young girl, going out to walk her dogs and still being victimized was insane. And I don't know about you, but even now to this day, when I hear about somebody being out with their dogs and still being victimized, it always blows my mind, because you would think that the dogs would be a deterrent. And people in that area felt the same way. They were, quote, united in their shock. Everybody was scared. Parents were picking their kids up from school. Nobody was going to this park anymore. And prior to this, it had been such a close, tight-knit, quiet community, and this had completely like shaken up everybody and like tore a hole in the fabric of their lives and made them realize that like horrible things can happen anywhere. And then the area where she was killed ended up being a place of remembrance for her, right? So there were flowers and photos and things left for her in her honor. And it just served as a reminder to the people who lived in that area that terrible, brutal things can happen to innocent people anywhere, even in a place that is so popular and often has so many people there. And Rachel's murder was actually the first murder to really hit Ireland's Jehovah's Witness community as well. At the time, there were about 5,000 people who were part of that church in that area, and they were all just like devastated and numb to hear about something this horrible happening. Horrible happening to somebody from their community. again, she was very involved in her church and even had the plans to be a missionary. Like that's what she wanted to do with her life. So she was very well known and very well loved. Now, immediately after Rachel's body was found, the investigation began. The area was cordoned off and they started going door to door immediately to interview anyone who was in the area to see if they could get any information that could lead them to who killed her. All in all, they ended up going to 1,000 different houses and conducting 500 interviews, man. And it was helpful though, because when they were speaking to people, they were getting little pieces of information that was helpful. They were figuring out who had been in the park, things like that. And one of the things that they were able to get from a witness was a timeline, because one person they spoke to was able to put Rachel in the park alive just 30 minutes before the dogs showed up back at her family's porch, right? Or scratching, I don't know if they had a porch, but scratching at the door. Okay. So the window of time for what happened to her was very small. Pretty instantly, the authorities in this case decided, I was going to say to make a plea, but it wasn't really to make a plea. They spoke to the press, and in doing that, they were speaking to the public, right? And they basically said that they wanted anyone who was in that park to come forward because they felt like whoever was in that park on that day was like the key to the information they needed in finding Rachel's killer. They specifically wanted anybody who was there at all from the hours of 2 to 8, which is like quite a large window of time, I would say. But they basically wanted all those people to come forward so that they could, one, rule them out, and two, see if they had seen anybody. So that if there was somebody who didn't come forward and they were like, but you were there, or you know what I mean, they could narrow down all of the Ireland people, all the people who were local to this part of Ireland. They needed to narrow them down to the one person responsible. And they felt like, see something, say something, obviously. And, there were several people that they questioned right in the beginning, because they did know of some people who had been in the park. There was even like a group of youngsters. They didn't say their ages, but they were not like baby children, but they were like younger kids who had been playing football. And I don't know if football in Ireland is football or if it's soccer. They were playing the sports, and they were playing like really close to where Rachel's body would eventually be found, which is just like so horrible. And they also were questioning basically any registered sex offenders who were in the area, because again, in the beginning at least, they didn't even know for sure if Rachel had been sexually assaulted, but they were operating under the assumption that it was a sexually motivated crime, so they were covering all their bases in that department as well. And, this may have had something to do with the fact that unspecified male DNA was found on Rachel when she was examined. So when police were bringing people in and questioning them, they were pretty much asking everybody for a DNA sample. And a lot of people were actually giving their DNA voluntarily, one, to be helpful, and two, so that they could be ruled out so that police could move on past them and go to somebody else who may be the suspect. So it was this long, I don't want to say long process, because it didn't take a super long time for an arrest to be made, but it was taking time. It wasn't something that happened like the same day. So in the meantime, her family just had to sit there and wait for answers and bury their daughter. Rachel's funeral was held in the Cork's Kingdom Hall, and this was on October 31st, Halloween. Close to 300 people attended the service, and her uncle Max Warner, he was an elder in the faith. He officiated her funeral, and he said that while he knew several people had to be finding it very hard to comprehend that Rachel, a young woman living her life in the quote right way, could be murdered how she was. And he said he was convinced that she had died in the belief that she would, quote, live in a paradise earth after the resurrection of the righteous. And he said specifically of this, and I quote, Rachel was a lovely person. If you went to her room, you'd always see the Bible open. She was always reading from it. She loved the Bible and she loved Jehovah. During the past month, she was going from house to house preaching the word of God. People are asking why something like this should happen to a righteous woman such as Rachel, but the answer is to be found in the Bible. Rachel learned at an early age that Jehovah loved all mankind. But still, people wanted answers, and thankfully this case would be solved rather quickly, as I mentioned, though I'm sure every day felt like an eternity to Rachel's parents and Rachel's sisters and her brother. But within a week of her being buried, and just days after her case was featured on a true crime reenactment show, I don't know if every case was done the same way, but in Rachel's case, they did a reenactment of what happened to her, and they put this on this TV show so that it could jog anybody's memory who may have been in the park that day, who may have seen something, so they could come forward with information. So, just days after her case was featured on this show, an arrest was made. Apparently, a 16-year-old kid was picked up at his house early AF in the morning, okay? And by that evening, he had been arrested and was charged with the rape and murder of Rachel Keeley. And this 16-year-old was Ian Horgan. Now, at the time Ian was arrested, as we sometimes see more often in cases from other countries than from the US, Ian was a minor at the time this crime was committed, so his identity was hidden, right? All they knew is that he was a local youth from the Ballincollig area. But now we know that this was Ian Horgan. Now, Ian Horgan was the eldest child with 3 siblings, and by all accounts, in his early years, he was a good kid. He was a good student, a good athlete. He was like big for his age. It was naturally a good underage footballer who could have played minor for Cork, apparently, and had also won several medals for running. Now, that was when he was younger because reportedly something went wrong around the age of 14 because he was then, quote unquote, dismissed from school for bad behavior, though his family would later say that he wasn't dismissed from school for bad behavior. The school just contacted his parents and said that it would be in their best interest, in his best interest, if he was pulled from school voluntarily, which I don't know about you, but that sounds like the same thing to me. But anyways, the point is he was no longer in school and had been working at a crate assembly factory at the time that Rachel was killed. And Rachel wasn't a stranger to him. Him and Rachel were actually neighbors. He lived right around the corner from her and had even attended her funeral. And if that's not bad enough, which it is, the day Rachel was killed, when Rose and Elizabeth were walking through that park looking for her, they actually ran into Ian. They walked right past them. They walked right past them? No, he walked right past them. They walked right past him, and they exchanged pleasantries. Rose said hello to him, and he said hello back, but notably looked down at the ground, never looked up at her, and just hurried past her. When Rachel was found dead, Ian's house was one of those 1,000 homes that was canvassed, that was knocked on, that was visited during their canvassing, and police had specifically spoken to Ian and had specifically taken his alibi since he was a dude in the area. He told police that that day he had been at work. He had gone at about 4:45 and had come home to eat during his lunch break. He said that he had then went to that park where he met a woman unrelated and walked with her for a while down a gravel road heading towards a bridge and an old rugby field where he then hung out for a while after he broke off from that woman. He said that he was there alone and he hadn't seen anybody, and during his questioning he seemed very cool, very calm, very put together, not nervous at all. Which, cool, calm, and collected is an interesting way for one to seem when they are lying, because he was lying. After he was arrested, police also spoke to his friends, and they found that the evening that Rachel was killed, he was with them, and that he had also seemed totally normal. Like later, a friend of his was questioned. This, I think, was actually at the trial. A friend of his was questioned about if Ian seemed like he had just killed somebody, and this friend was basically like, first off, I don't think that I could ever tell by looking at somebody if they had just murdered somebody. But Ian didn't seem nervous, didn't seem jumpy, didn't seem strange at all. Prior to meeting his friends at their house to watch TV, Ian and these friends had been at Regional Park. And they had been there for a while, and then they were all going to leave at about 5 o'clock and meet up at this friend's house to watch TV. And Ian said he would be there in about 10 minutes. But instead, 25 minutes later, he went back to the park where he was spotted by an old babysitter of his. So this would have been at about 5:30. From there, he met up at a friend's house at about 6:30 to watch some TV. And after they had, him and all of these friends went back to this park again. Apparently, they were just bouncing back and forth from place to place. So they're at the house watching TV. Then they go back to the park again to ride motorbikes around. But when they got there, they ended up leaving rather quickly because they found that there were cops in the area, and they were under the impression that, well, they weren't under the impression. They knew that they could get in trouble for riding the motorbikes without tax and insurance. Ireland's different than the US. I don't know about that, but basically they were under the impression that if they got caught, they could get 3 years for this. And that is because about I think it was like a week before Rachel was killed, Ian had been riding his motorbike and he had ran a red light, I believe it was, and ended up getting charged for this. And he talked to a friend of his who like knew more about the law than him and told him that for the charges that he had, he could get 3 years. Is basically what it came down to. Now that does seem random, but it's going to come up when we talk about his alibi, okay? Or not really his alibi as much as his reasoning for doing some other shady shit after Rachel went missing, which we will get into. But before we get there, when they talked to all of his friends, they all said that he seemed normal, that none of his behavior raised any alarm bells, except for one friend. One friend said that a few days after Rachel was killed, that's when Ian seemed a little bit weird, that Ian had like contacted this friend and said that he was nervous. And he was nervous because he was worried that police were going to find evidence that linked him to Rachel's murder. And what he was talking about was a soda bottle that he had left out in the park. He said that he had been out there like before Rachel was killed and had been drinking alcohol and had left it. And he was worried that police were going to find this bottle and link him to Rachel's murder that way. And he was correct. They did find this bottle and it had his fingerprint on it. And they also found a plastic bag with his fingerprint on it. And they were both found near Rachel's body. Now, I will say that that would be a weird thing to remember because I don't think I could tell you that I had left a bottle in a park days before a murder was committed. I don't think I would remember that because it wouldn't be significant. It would only be significant, in my opinion, if something significant had happened the day that you left the bottle. Do you know what I mean? But anyways, that could just be me. I just found that to be a little bit weird. And police thought it was weird too. But it wasn't the only thing they had against him. They also had witnesses who had seen him in the park and had heard him say strange things. For example, there was a neighbor of his named Josephine, I believe, and Josephine had run into Ian that night, the night that Rachel was killed, at about 8:45 p.m. And she asked him, like, what is going on? Why are there all of these ambulances at the park? Do you know what happened? And that's when he told her that Rachel Keeley had gotten, quote, beat up. Now, at the time that the woman heard this from Ian, she didn't think it was a big deal. She didn't report this to the police because she didn't realize at that time he was telling her something that he should not know yet. So, anyways, he was arrested. And at the time of his arrest, he had some marks on his body. He literally had cuts and scrapes to his face and also to his wrists that made it look like he was in some sort of altercation. Specifically, he had, quote, 1/4 inch rugged cut on the right side of his face and very small scratches or tears in the skin, like something from a bush or briars on the back of both wrists. Now, when explaining these injuries, Ian just said that he had fallen off his motorbike a couple of times. And for the record, when Rachel's body was examined, there was not DNA found under her fingernails. And this was something that his attorney was going to try to use at trial to say that he couldn't have killed her because if he had, she would have scratched him and her, the DNA would be under her fingernails. But apparently it's not super uncommon for DNA not to be under the fingernails of somebody, even if they had been scratching. And basically, the prosecution's doctor said that the lack of DNA meant nothing. And that did seem to be true, that the lack of DNA evidence in this case didn't really mean anything because once Ian was arrested, he did give a hair sample and he did give a saliva sample. He didn't give a blood sample because he was afraid of needles. But this didn't matter because you may recall that there was DNA found on Rachel. Well, the DNA that was found was semen. Okay. And it was found both on her underwear and on her outer clothing. And when it was tested against Ian, it was a match. And it was like a 1 in a 650 million% chance, or one, you know what I'm saying? 1 in 650 million chance that this DNA would match to anybody else. That sentence just fucking lost me, bro. Oh my gosh. But basically, what it came down to is that it was him. Okay. They even said that it was like the likelihood of this DNA being a match to somebody who was just randomly grabbed off the street that wasn't related would be like 1 in a billion. Like it was him. It was him, is the point. The DNA belonged to him. So they had a strong case against him. And like he was young, dude. So when they had his first hearing, his mother broke down because to this point, he had been a troublemaker, but he hadn't been a criminal, But now he was, dude. He had been arrested for murder. Now, when Ian went to trial, his mother did testify on his behalf, and I feel like she might have felt like she needed to. And that's because I didn't mention this yet, but 2 days after Rachel's body was found in that park, Ian freaked out and fled the area. His parents had no idea where he went. They freaked out. They called the cops and they reported him missing. And the cops ended up picking him up on the roadside between 11:30 and 12 that same night. And he told the cops that he thought he was in, quote, serious trouble over his motorbike and decided to go to Kilkenny, I think is the place, to visit like a girl that he knew. This was his excuse for running off 2 days after a girl's body was found, a girl whose murder he would then end up arrested for. So his mother testified about this because he would need to have some sort of explanation as to why he would do something like that. And basically, she told the court like their house was one of the 1,000 that was searched and or knocked on during the canvassing, right after Rachel was killed, and that when the police came to the house and questioned Ian about Rachel's murder, he panicked. He freaked out. But she says that he freaked out about the motorbike situation, that it wasn't about the murder. It was that he was worried he was going to get 3 years in jail for riding his motorbike without this tax and this license, like he felt, or the tax and the insurance that he thought he had to have, right? And so he decided he was going to leave. And when he told his mother this, she was like, whoa, 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 whoa. You shouldn't do that. Don't you think it would look suspicious if you just took off after being questioned about a murdered girl? But still, he did leave. He left after this happened and again claimed that it had to do with the motorbike insurance situation. Now, Ian did testify on his own behalf in his first trial. He told the court that he did not hurt Rachel. He said that he barely knew Rachel. He said he went to school with her brother and would like recognize her on the street and may say hello, but that he did not hurt her. And that's all good and well too, but they had so much evidence against Ian. Like, for example, Rachel's body was found in an area that Ian frequented, not just the park, but specifically near the ruin of that house. He admitted, one, to being there all the time. And even if he hadn't admitted to it, they found several areas where he had spray painted his own name or the name of him and his girlfriend. And it wasn't just that kind of stuff, the circumstantial stuff that put him there. There was also the DNA, as I already mentioned. And there was also more physical evidence that linked him to Rachel. And this was very notable because he said that he hadn't seen Rachel that day at all. He said that he hadn't even seen her in close to a month. So any trace DNA between the two of them would make no sense based on what he was saying. In addition to his DNA being found on her, which is already like, come on, man, that's pretty damning. There were also lots of fibers found in this case. There were fibers on Rachel that came from Ian's clothing, and there were fibers on Ian that came from Rachel's clothing. There were fibers taken from Rachel's clothes that were a match to a sweater that was recovered from Ian's bedroom after he was arrested. There were also red fibers that were found on Rachel's sweater that were a match to this red hat that Ian owned. It was the Arsenal Football Club hat, and this hat was found abandoned with Ian's motorbike at the park the day that Rachel was killed. And Ian couldn't even deny that this hat belonged to him. They knew it belonged to him. And fibers from that hat were also found on his clothes. Now, at trial, Ian's defense attorney did try to discredit the discredit the credibility of the DNA evidence, saying that some of the tubes weren't sealed properly and therefore there could have been some contamination. Though they did admit that it would be unlikely for contamination to be that serious to the degree that somebody who is innocent would have their DNA somehow in places that it shouldn't be if they didn't do it right. Basically said that if the DNA evidence was bad, then that would mean that somebody deliberately tried to frame this 16-year-old kid. And why would they do that? Especially when at this point he didn't have a record, the record that he would go on to have. You should never frame anyone, period. But it would be much more likely for somebody to try to frame somebody, I would think, that had a record so it made sense than a random 16-year-old child. But that did not stop his defense attorney from trying to go down the bad or unreliable DNA evidence route. In closing, the defense said that the prosecution was blinded by the science in this case, which, what a thing to be blinded by, I say. But he continued by saying that forensic evidence can be misleading or incorrect, and then referenced the case of the Birmingham Six. Now, if you're unfamiliar, because I was unfamiliar, quote, the Birmingham Six were six men from Northern Ireland who were each sentenced to life imprisonment in 1975 following their false convictions for the 1974 Birmingham pub bombings. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory and quashed by the Court of Appeal on March 14th, 1991. Now, I have never heard of this case, but apparently